And Antonio was my partner before I became the chief planner, and we, in fact, started Office for Urbanism many years ago together. And when you're partners and you're in a small firm, you don't end up in the same room together very often. So I rarely get to see Antonio's presentations, but I love them. And as you heard him say at the beginning that you would hear some of my ideas in there. When you work with someone side by side for a very long time, Antonio and I like to say that we complete each other's sentences. And so I could anticipate the slides. I haven't seen that presentation before, but I could see it coming. I could see the rationale coming. So that was a real pleasure for me, Antonio. Thank you very much. I hope others enjoyed it as well.
Absolutely. And let me say, I didn't know, I haven't seen his presentation before, but I have seen in my lifetime hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of presentations, and I've been living with teachers all my life. My family are all teachers. I was a teacher, and I've seen people teach. And let me tell you, you're as good as I've seen as a teacher, whatever it is. And so the next time I'm trying to sell something, I'm going to call you. At any rate, it was a real pleasure. I don't know about you, but as I can tell by the clapping, it's probably true. I learned so much just by watching your very inventive use of graphics and your willingness to speak in a clear way.
Okay, you better stop. It's starting to sound like a setup.
It's not a setup.
It wasn't a setup, but it's a very good lead into our next panel, which is on density. Antonio set it up very nicely. He talked about the greater the density, the lower the cost. He made the connection. I love the little graphic, TOD, ROI, right. BFF. I've got a 13-year-old daughter, so yeah. BFF. I think the very important point that this is actually about, it's not just about building more sustainable cities from an environmental perspective, but it's also about building cities we can afford.
Well, yes, and it's worth remembering that for most people in neighborhoods where new developments is coming their way, there are two words that are what H.I. Hayakawa, the old linguist, used to say. They're all words in English are either purr words or snarl words. and snarl words, when it comes to redevelopment of the neighborhood, are density and height. Right?
Absolutely.
And very often, if they don't know why they don't like it, you'll find them, they'll say density and height. And so it's going to be really something to hear people talk about why density is flexible and useful and what you can do with it.
Well, and there's a catch-22, and I hope our panelists will get into this, because the reality is when you put in a lot of density, if it's not done well, the impact is really significant. So if you're going to have a lot of density, and Antonio showed some slides of density not done well, I shuddered when I saw that image of all the buildings crammed up against each other, because let's face it, if you're in the middle, you're getting no air and no light. Pretty fundamental to survival. And I guess the challenge is you need to do the density really, really well if you're going to create a great and sustainable city. So that's the catch-22. So, in some ways, I recognize and I acknowledge that fear of density comes from a very legitimate place.
It does, and also if it's not relieved by good design, as you point out, and people know that it's an ugly thing they don't want, they won't say ugly because they're polite. They will talk density and height when they're really talking ugly.
Yeah, that's true. But there's another catch-22 there, because I think we have some great projects in this city that are dense, that are not too dense, but that do use much better use of existing infrastructure, and they actually are beautiful, and yet residents still oppose them. And that, to me, is a real risk to the city moving forward in the future.
Maybe density is just not buildings. Maybe it's because they're dense. No.
Well, no, don't go there.
I got my word, sure.
No, but we have to acknowledge it comes from a legitimate place, but we have to be reasonable, because we know that the way we built in the past isn't the way we can build in the future. We know we aren't as rich as we thought we were. We can't have 12 people per hectare, as Antonio said. It's just not enough people to be able to sustain our city and have the innovative kind of infrastructure that we know we need, as we saw in Robert's presentation.
Right. So let's hear from the panel.
Let's hear from the panel.
We've got an excellent panel to discuss all of these things. We begin with Calvin Gladney from Washington, D.C. He's the managing partner, Mosaic Urban Planners.
We're partners.
Welcome.
Full partner. From New York City, Michaela Crater, who's the Vice President, Industrial Initiatives and Income Mobility at the New York City Economic Development. And yes.
Welcome, Michaela.
Welcome. And Wendy Kukier of Vice President, Research and Innovation, Ryerson University. And finally, from Vancouver, John Longbottom, Smart Cities Leader for IBM Canada. There we are. There's the panel.
Well, good morning. One of the first questions that I wanted to ask the group here today was to give us some examples of innovative density in their cities. And we were talking about Washington, New York, and Toronto, 3 very big cities. And as well, maybe some considerations about the ramification of density in these cities. And Wendy actually has some slides that we can review in answer to that question. So I'd like to turn that over to you, Wendy.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I wanted to illustrate this first question with some examples, I think, that illustrate much of what's been talked about over the last couple of days. Ryerson University, how many people have been on the Ryerson campus? How many of you are my students? Ryerson University, I think, exemplifies in some ways both the challenges and the opportunities associated with density. So if you look at the diagram behind it, it compares the York University campus, the University of Toronto campus, and the Ryerson campus spatially. Ryerson has about 30,000 students. U of T at that time had about 45, and York about the same number. So I think you can see what we were challenged with. We're right in the downtown core, in the busiest intersection in the heart of the city. So some of the ways in which we have engaged with the city, brought the university into the city into the university, I think are illustrated here. This is the corner of Dundas and Bay on the west side about 10 years ago. And this is the corner now, the Ted Rogers School of Management, which is a very innovative partnership with Cadillac Fairview in Ryerson. Ground floor retail, 2 floors of parking, 3 floors of the largest business school in the country, and we own the air rights for further development. And I should mention, just based on the last comments, that on the 9th floor, there is a Japanese garden in the middle of the building. Wow. Young in Dundas, circa about 5 years ago. Young in Dundas today. And you'll see that the AMC theaters are there. Ryerson entered into an innovative partnership with Cineplex Odeon, which had theaters. We needed rooms for students. So we traded the air rights that we had for that building in exchange for having access to the theaters during certain hours during the day to use them as classrooms. It's also the home of our incubator. I don't know if anyone from Google is still here, but we took over the Google space. We have 40,000 square feet of a digital media zone, which is an incubator that currently hosts about 60 companies and has created more than 600 jobs in the last 2 years alone. This is another site, which is the old Maple Leaf Gardens. Hockey fans are probably very sad, but Maple Leaf Gardens lay dormant for about 10 years with a partnership involving Loblaw. We renovated the building, again, ground floor retail. It's one of the biggest Loblaw stores, Joe Fresh. We moved center ice to the 3rd floor. And I'm not a hockey fan, but I've seen grown men cry when they come into the building. It's an opportunity not just to expand athletics for our students, but a huge number of community initiatives come out of there, including summer camps, which combine athletics with mathematics education for kids in priority neighborhoods. The corner of Gould and Victoria, it used to be an old brewery, was our image arts school. We've now put in the Ryerson Image Center, which was made possible through a very large anonymous donation of more than 80,000 black and white photographs, the Black Star collection, which represents a large percentage of the images that were used by Time, Life, and many of the periodicals from the 1920s through to the 1990s. It's been identified as one of the world's leading photographic galleries now, and the traffic through is immense. One of the things that really differentiates Ryerson from many other university campuses, even those that are downtown, is that 95% of the people walking through are not Ryerson students. It creates huge opportunities, some challenges. And the last, but not least, most of you probably know the iconic corner of Gould and Young, Sam the Record Man. And this part of the city has been undergoing transformation for many years. What we've been able to do has been in large part as a result of forward-thinking city planners as well as local politicians, municipal politicians, and so on. But this is what that corner will look like in 2015 with our new Student Learning Center. So I give you these as just a few examples of how Ryerson has coped with density, and the principles that we've embraced are the idea of density, the idea of design. We have leading architects not just from within Canada but from around the world involved, and pedestrianization. So as I said, the traffic through this area is huge, and I think most people would agree that it's contributed significantly, not just in terms of economic and intellectual vibrancy, but also culture.
Well, that's great. Thanks, Wendy. Appreciate
Thank you.
it. Michaela, how about some examples of some innovative density, perhaps, in New York?
So in New York City, we've tried to manage and cope with density in a couple different ways, and oftentimes I think city government we try to be agnostic. Just let the market take its course. And New York City is particularly one that really embraces or just lets the real estate market be what it is, and the influences there are very strong. Sounds like they're somewhat similar here in some respects. But a recent effort by the mayor was to launch this concept called micro apartments. And so they created a competition. We're very fond of competitions in New York. We're very competitive. We have a reputation for that. But this micro apartment competition asked designers, architects to propose what they would do in making a small, basically a studio, but under 1,000 square feet. I think it was like under 500, 350, I believe, was the square foot challenge. And so it led to some really interesting, innovative ideas. And the hope, of course, is not just that it provides a new way of creating affordability for the new millennials coming in, or young folks, so they can afford to live in New York City, but also it has spurred the potential growth of other designers who are filling out those apartments with designs. You have to have different types of appliances. You have to have different types of, things that are going to be able to be nimble enough for a small apartment. So that's one example.
Great. Kelvin, what about the ramifications of this density? You had some perspective on that?
Yeah, it's actually kind of interesting because there's a real difference in the density in terms of the who. So the people who are coming are different than the people who were there. One example of that is the millennial generation. So how many people here would consider themselves millennials? How many people are raising a millennial? How many people wish they were a millennial? Nice. So the millennials think differently. I would say they, as an example, they don't want your McMansions, right? They don't want your big new construction house in the suburbs, not near amenities. They'll take a micro apartment because they are interested in experiences, not their personal space. They don't want your McMansions. They don't want your McDonald's. They eat differently. They more organic, more healthy, recycle, reuse, reduce, all of those things. No McMansions, no McDonald's. And then a place where I think there's a lot of need for innovation is they don't want I'll say it. They don't want your stinking meetings. So we've been doing the same community engagement, community outreach process since the 1940s. They don't want to meet in a church basement. They don't want to meet at 6 p.m. They want to be visual. They want to text. They don't like necessarily getting up in front of groups because those meetings are biased towards people that like to speak in public or hyper-articulate. They can tell a story with a picture. And so we need to innovate based on this new density to really know that there are differences in the people who are coming, and therefore there needs to be differences in how we design our spaces, how we design our places, and how we think about our places.
That's great. With billions of people coming into our cities over the next 25 years, how are we going to handle that crush of people? Is it going to end up being some urban dystopia, or is it going to be a place we can live? Do you have some perspective on that? Who wants to maybe take that?
I think, one of the ways, we've been trying to adopt, use innovative strategies to reach and grow businesses in New York has really taken advantage of the fact that we have such a dense city, but that there's new forms of technology. So, one of the ways, and it was kind of expressed, I think, yesterday, is there are different ways to engage the broader public to influence the design and the planning of places. And so, whether it is using crowdsourcing as a way to collect information, for example, an innovative way that we had to respond to the Storm Sandy when we had a gas shortage was working with a tech firm, I think out in the Midwest. It's an app that's called Gas Buddy, and we couldn't keep track of which gas stations were open, and there were huge lines, and there was actually, unfortunately some violence that was erupting at some of these places. And so that was a way of just distilling information very quickly, very rapidly, and actually kept the city informed about where were the gas stations that were open, how much did they have. So, I guess I may be twisting or kind of answering in a slightly different way the question, but, really I think using the diversity of people, using the density of people with information and knowledge, I think there's just a great opportunity as that increases, matching that and marrying that with technology and letting technology be able to collect information in a way that we have never been able to, and use that as a way to influence policy or programs and respond to the needs of a very dynamic and obviously a very diverse group.
Kelvin?
So I'm going to try to channel Jane Jacobs for a second in terms of how we should deal with this new density. And I think we have to sort of embrace the messiness of it. We have to embrace the fact that people of different backgrounds are going to bump into each other, and let's design our places and our buildings and our neighborhoods to embrace those intersections rather than build silos. Let's make it outwardly focused rather than inwardly focused. There's been a lot of talk during this conference about this kind of intersection of transportation and transit choices and economic development. And this messiness, this new density, forces us to rethink how we move people around. And so we need to embrace having a streetcar that's on the street. Well, that changes that you talked about pedestrians. Well, that changes the interaction of pedestrians with the street, where they now have to look for a bike in the bike lane, a car driving down the street, the streetcar, maybe it's bus, maybe it's light rail. So we need to rethink with all of this sort of messiness of pedestrians and bikers and all of this sort of multimodal activity, we need to rethink how all of those interactions work, and we need to do it soon.
Terrific. Wendy, you have a perspective on that?
I think that we're already starting to see in Toronto some of the challenges, and we've heard a lot about those in the last few days. But I think the city has also been a remarkable success story, not just within Canada, but around the world. If you think about the level of diversity in this city, the fact that half of Torontonians were born outside of the city, the fact that half of the population are racialized minorities, the fact that we have one of the lowest crime rates in any major city in the world. Last year there were 50 murders in Toronto, and crime is not the only indicator of the health of the city, but there were 50 murders in Toronto last year. We have 3 million people, and most cities of comparable size in other parts of North America suffer much more severely because of some of these tensions and conflicts and inequalities. So I think there's some things we're doing remarkably well that we have to keep doing. We have to make sure that public policy and social programs continue to address that side of the equation. And then, of course, we have to grapple with the environmental and transportation challenges as well. But I think there's a huge richness to the diversity that is Toronto, and I think we have to continue to celebrate and leverage that for success.
Can I?
Yeah, I want to pick that up too. But Calvin, go ahead.
Because there's racial diversity, but there's also an income diversity. That's another ramification of the densification of cities, particularly since living in cities is now the cool thing. So in Washington D.C. we have a neighborhood called Columbia Heights. Anyone ever been to Columbia Heights? Great. And so Columbia Heights was a relatively poor, relatively Hispanic and African American community or neighborhood in Washington, D.C., all the way up to really the early 90s. And, through a number of sort of public policy choices, where the city took city-owned land and parceled it out to developers, and they built high-rise buildings right next to a new heavy rail stop. So what that did was, and then a lot of people on their own decided to renovate a lot of the row houses in the area. So what happened was you had a change in not only the demographics in terms of race, but you had a change in the income demographics. And what that happens, and that goes back to messiness, sort of the downside of messiness, is you saw a stark increase in the number of property crimes. Mm-hmm. You saw a stark increase in the number of snatch and grabs. And part of that is when people sort of, it's one thing, I actually grew up poor in Brooklyn, New York. But there's one thing to grow up poor where everyone else around you is poor. But there's another thing to grow up poor where you're like, what am I going to eat today? And there's this guy walking by typing on his iPad and you're trying to figure out what are you going to do to eat. And not saying that any of that is right to make those bad decisions, but it is part of the sort of negative ramifications of some of this messiness. And it's something that governments, developers, designers, and I actually want to stop and say designers in design has to think about these things up front. So a lot of times, depending on the developer, of course, the design is sort of the cherry on the top. And the design doesn't think about its ramifications for safety, its ramifications to what it evokes to the population there and the population coming. And so those kind of design issues also have some ramifications for this new density.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on that because I think there's been a lot of focus in the last day and a half.
Can you use this instead?
Oh, sorry.
It's on.
I think there's been a lot of focus the last day and a half on physical infrastructure, whether it relates to transportation or environmental issues. And I think we have to think about human infrastructure as well. And there's no question that if we don't have policies in place to address disparity in income, if we don't have opportunities for young people, if we don't have appropriate training, job creation, social innovation, and so on, we will face equally dire consequences. And I think it's really important to think about sustainability in cities from a social as well as a economic and environmental perspective.
Just to build on that, that's something that, I think New York has really struggled with, and the agency I work on is actually the Economic Development Corporation. So we're the economic arm for the mayor, and we oftentimes get criticized on not doing enough on this very issue. We support huge projects, malls, stadiums, mixed use, but we haven't done anything about the neighborhoods in which these big projects are being built in to help rise up the lives of those individuals, oftentimes who have been in multiple generations and cycles of poverty. So recently we launched a new suite of initiatives that is really targeted on this very issue, trying to connect the disconnected youth who don't have skills or not in jobs. And we identified the growth sectors in New York City, specifically in the tech space and health tech and IT. And we've worked and partnered now with nonprofits to kind of go beyond their normal training programs, building up their curriculum to go beyond what their standard practices are to help fill that gap between what we saw from our perspective in analysis of where those growth sectors, and then what these nonprofits do best is they know the community, they have the connectivity there. So we're helping them connect. And that's one, I think, thing that I think a lot of larger institutions and government can do is, we can be that bridge. We can, maybe we don't have huge amounts of resources at our disposal, but we have the power and influence of our size and our width and breadth of relationships to build those bridges, and I think it's we need to do more of that, and I'm happy to say that we're at New York we're trying to start doing that.
So we're touching on this idea of diversity as part of really a major part of density, and it's very affiliated. And do you have some perspectives on what are the opportunities, maybe what are the challenges, and around that notion of diversity and sort of this people element, the social element in the context of density?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, though, we shouldn't talk about density and say it like it's the D word, like it's all negative, right? I mean, density brings amenities to cities. If you want new retailers, if you want new places to go, that usually requires density. So, even in the suburbs where now they're thinking about town center models, one of the reasons they have to think about multifamily as opposed to new single family development is it's the density, it's the rooftops that bring retail. And it's not rooftops any longer, right? It's buildings, it's people. So I didn't want the implication that all of this talk of density is only about negative ramifications, because there's a lot of positivity that you get from density that, doesn't get talked about enough.
Great. Can you maybe...
Yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think one of the largest challenges, especially if anyone who's either on the receiving side to being witness to a new proposed project, and you see how it would shift the landscape in your neighborhood, one of the largest challenges is it's more than, I think, the D word. It's more about change. And how much have I as a stakeholder, as a person in this neighborhood, feel like I'm influencing this project? Is it really responding to my needs? And how, if you're on the government side, how do you communicate, or how do you ensure that the concept, the proposal, the project that's dependent on density really is bringing everyone along and is useful for everyone? And that's something I think we can use, again, other forms of technology and communication tools, and expand our toolkit to communicate the benefits and also play out scenarios. I mean, I think oftentimes I've worked on the sort of the grassroots side. I now work in government. One of the things I've noticed is that, as someone who straddled both worlds, I know kind of what we need on the city side to make a project happen, and oftentimes we don't do a good job translating that to folks on the ground, to explain, like, the only way the financials of this will work is if we have X amount of space for X amount of type of activity. And I think the more we break this sort of nuts and bolts down to people of diverse backgrounds and meeting them where they're at, communicating on their level, they may not have professional degrees. So what is it that we can use? What forms of technology can we use to just visually show what we mean by this? I think that's, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, there's just so many positives, right? I mean, density brings retail. Density brings safety. The more people, the more eyes on the street. The more you feel safe, the more they feel safe. That brings more people. There's just so many important things. And then I think, I'll hand this to you, I think the diversity that comes with density also brings a lot of positives.
Yeah, and there's no question that density also makes public transportation a lot more cost effective. And I see Bonnie Crombie from City of Mississauga in the audience, and some of the differences between the issues in the 905 area versus downtown Toronto around public transit, I'm sure are concerns. But I couldn't leave the panel without talking about diversity from the same perspective. So while it's true that diversity, disparity, and difference can produce conflict, can produce challenges, I think what we've seen in Toronto, and certainly in your cities as well, that they also offer a kind of richness that is really positioning large urban centers for the 21st century. And if you think about globalization, whether you like it, whether you hate it, there's no question that, for example, for Canada, our economic growth depends on building global markets. And we have seen such amazing opportunities created by the citizens who have been born outside the country in terms of leveraging their personal networks to build those relationships. I see it all the time when I go to India, China, Brazil, virtually anywhere in the world. Ryerson faculty and students and partners who have links to those countries can open doors. And I think that we have to, we certainly have challenges in Canada still. Immigrants are underemployed and underpaid, as are many women. But I think we have to continually recognize that talent is our most valuable resource, perhaps next to water. And we have to be leveraging that effectively. We know that diversity promotes innovation, and so I think people who are maybe disinclined to open doors and welcome people in who look or think differently than them, whether it's a millennial with tattoos and piercings, or whether it's
They don't all have tattoos and piercings, by the way.
but more of them do than boomers.
Can I pick up on your immigrant point for a
think that's
second? I'll
important.
give you a Washington, D.C. example. Now, Washington, D.C. apparently, I'm told, has the most number of Ethiopians outside of Ethiopia. So if you go to a local coffee shop in Washington, D.C., you'll see a number of Ethiopians and folks that are from Europe who are sitting outside in chairs. And they'll be there for hours. But the innovation, so small innovation, public realm, is that they sit outwardly facing. How are you? How are you? They nod, they say hello. Now, us Americans, we cappuccino, we're on our cell phone. They're sitting out. And that's welcoming. And that changes the experience in the public realm. And so that diversity, that difference in just how you approach every day drinking a cup of Joe is just one of those things that makes the place more vibrant, makes it more interesting.
Michaela, have you seen that sort of thing in New York, the advantages of diversity and how you exploit that?
Yeah, actually, we've seen it in a couple different ways. I mean, going back kind of, or focusing again on the sort of the space I work in, economic development, what we've seen is, there is still companies who want to build things or make things in New York City, or just cater to the clients in New York. And it's really difficult, as I'm sure in any city, to navigate bureaucracy when you start a business. But the ones that survive, they have found a way to really connect to that customer base. And because there's hyper levels of diversity, they can create some really interesting niche products and really niche services to that very hyper diverse customer base. And what's incredible is because it is global in terms of, these are people maybe in New York, but they're in other countries as well, whether whatever their background or language, they can, actually grow beyond New York. And again, because they've tested that product, they've tested their market in New York, and it gives them a good sort of test case as a way to expand on beyond New York City. But I've seen, it's been incredible in terms of, because, where else can you, get these types of markets tested in one city. And I think that's one exciting thing that comes with the diversity is for business developments. You can really test out that product and really get a sense, will this, from this influence of this culture, this, sort of priorities or biases that come from depending on where your background is, you can really test that out.
Great. Kelvin, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I just thought of a sort of development example of how this diversity has changed things. A lot of developers now in the multifamily buildings are building what looks to be and acts more like a dorm than sort of single apartments. There's much more communal space. Your individual space is very small. And that happens because millennials think that way, act that way. But it also happens, interestingly enough, and we see this in DC, because of immigrants who are trying to intermingle into this society, and maybe, depending on the situation, would prefer to have a bridge or a transition. So there's a number of cases. I actually teach a class on entrepreneurship at Georgetown. And one of my students, so we have a business plan as our final assignment. And one of the students' business plan was essentially buying a number of row houses and creating an immersion redevelopment of these row houses so that people who were, I think, from China could all move into the same home. They would provide them services. If they wanted to start a business, they would help them navigate the bureaucracy. But it also gave them sort of a safe place. But that's a development ramification because those rooms act differently. They're smaller. The communal space acts differently. And, you know, the last thing is just the technology-enabled differences in development now are another thing that's different.
I just wanted to add one point, because one of the challenges Canada has, which is less acute in the United States, is around the culture of innovation and the culture of entrepreneurship. It's more embedded in your sort of national stories than it is in Canada, and yet we know that that's really the secret to economic growth and development. And there, you know, we've done a lot of research on this. Entrepreneurs are overrepresented among immigrant populations in this country. If you go to the digital media zone, half of the entrepreneurs there were born outside of Canada. And I think that is a value that is being injected into our culture and an economy that is absolutely fundamental to our ongoing success.
Yeah.
Great. We're checking how we're doing for time. I just had one last quick question, Calvin, if I could. You know, being the Smart Cities guy, it's only fair for me to ask this technology question because I know some of the narrative is sort of creeped in through the conversation today. And just give me your perspective on technologies that might apply to, you know, density and diversity and entrepreneurship and innovation, et cetera. And just on your view, is it a good thing, is it a bad thing? Maybe give some examples of where you've seen it work. Maybe, Michaela, start with you.
Sure. So we've really embraced technology in various ways and have a number of things where we've really tried to build the platform so that people who are in the startup community feel they get access to information that they wouldn't normally have. We have competitions like our Big Ops competition. And actually this year that we currently are running it, we've expanded the program and been a little more prescriptive using what we have, which is a whole bunch of city data. We've worked with a nonprofit community who works in economic development issues and income mobility issues, and we've worked with them to develop problem statements specifically about access to jobs, access to resources, so that if you're a new immigrant, how can I get an English class, or if you're disconnected because you left, you're isolated and whatnot, how can I get those services? And using the apps as a way to connect people in a way that we haven't done before. We're even doing it in terms of like thinking of, and challenging daycare. How can you make daycare more accessible if you can't, find a place? If you put in certain information, we're hoping that someone will develop an app specifically for that. So that's one way. We've used the sort of beauty of the city in terms of our size and the size of information, embracing and opening that information to the technology community and challenging them a little more specifically with things that we are trying to figure out a solution for, but we haven't yet.
Great. Wendy?
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind. I mean, Ryerson, of course, does standard research and innovation, and some of the areas that they're doing a lot of work on are things like smart grid, smart transportation systems. We have a new center on cloud and context-aware computing. Mobile computing, without question, represents huge opportunities. And I was just thinking as well, some of the things we're doing with e-learning are allowing us to better utilize space. So we're moving towards more blended classes where students, instead of coming to class for 13 weeks, might be in class only 6 weeks and doing more work independently, so we can actually put twice as many classes in the same space. So we're using it to address density as well. The only thing that I would urge people to remember is that technology is a tool, it's not a panacea. And certainly social media has huge potential to engage different communities and address diversity. But people have been talking about the environmental issues purely as if technology is a solution. And remember that technology from the point of view of energy conservation, technology from the point of view of of waste management also presents some challenges. So I think it's really important that if we're talking green, we recognize that we have to have a green tech strategy, that technology is not always the solution. It comes with its own unintended consequences at times.
Okay, great. Wendy and Kelly, Jim. So I tell you what, we have a few minutes left. Why don't we open the floor to questions? And it's been a really great discussion so far. Thank you. Questions? Here's one right here. We got the microphone, please.
So I love the fact that we're talking about the millennials as the future. We're planning for them. We're planning, and I like that. The problem is the millennials also don't vote. So when it comes to public policy decisions, as planners and as citizens, we can, take all this information and say, this is brilliant, we're coming up with some good stuff. Politicians have the hard play of coming to the point where they're planning for somebody who's not actually engaged. I don't know if you want to speak to that at all, but I think that that's a really interesting dichotomy.
Kelvin.
It's our fault. I mean, how do you vote? You have to go to a building. You have to stand on a line. It's not efficient. It's not fast. It's not in real time. You don't have all the information at your disposal. So if you're a millennial, you grow up with real-time information. Everything is as efficient as it possibly can be, and you can do whatever you want when you want it. So some of us grew up where you listened to whatever was on the radio at the time. You didn't get to self-select exactly what you listened to when you listened to it. And so if you have a generation of folks who find it inherently how they live that everything needs to be effective and efficient and in real time and they can have it when they want it, then why do they have to vote at a certain period of time in a certain place using a certain system? So it's our fault that they don't vote. I bet you if there was the ability to text message your vote, do you think millennials would vote if you could text message your vote? If you could Instagram a yes or a no, would they vote? So I think it's our fault.
That's great. Wendy?
I think it is our fault, but for different reasons.
I just made that up.
Yeah. I think part of the problem is young people's engagement in the political process. And I remember giving a talk at an Amnesty International Alternative G8 meeting, and I said, how many of you were protesting in Seattle? How many of you were protesting in Quebec City? How many of you know the name of your member of parliament? And I
What's
think
parliament?
yeah, I think the disengagement of young people is partly perhaps how we do the processes, but I think it's also the connections between public policy and the things that they care about. So we've heard a lot about how much they care about the environment, but I'm not sure that the big policy issues and the role of local, provincial, federal governments have been made clear in terms of advancing some of those issues. So I think there's a really big challenge, and I think one of the reasons, on the other hand, why the pollsters are proving to be wrong over and over and over again is traditional polling methods count people like me who actually answer the telephone and are much less effective.
Call me on my home phone that I don't have?
Yeah. I think are much less effective in tracking what's going on with the millennials and the digital natives. And I think that's going to create some real challenges and opportunities.
Great. One more question. Microphone here if we could, please.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on some of the comments that you've all made about working with low income and the real notion of class. When we talk about density and we talk about all these new millenniums, these are millenniums that are still with a $1,500 laptop and whatnot. There is a huge swath of our communities and urban centers, folks who used to work in steel mills, folks who used to work on industrial lands that just aren't there anymore. that job training is only going to be limited to so much because of their history. So part of that is that does density in this new, as we rebuild our urban cities, is there just a collateral damage that we will lose some people because despite all our best training opportunities, we can't send everyone to college? And, we then fall, those folks are permanently out and disenfranchised and don't vote, and not because they would text a vote, they just don't see any reason why they should.
Good question, Wendy.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
So, I mean, the point you've made and the question you raised is exactly kind of what we've challenged ourselves in New York City to face, or try to think about some innovative ways to address that problem. So, I work both on two different categories of issues. The income mobility issues, which we've created a series of initiatives to connect those disconnected individuals who may not be going off to college but need to do more than a retail job. So we've identified the sort of opportunities and career paths to get them skills so they have a resume so that they could hopefully get a job. And one way we've done that is we have this new platform with online work. So we typically, there's a number of classes throughout the city for just learning how to be on the computer. Well, we ask those folks who do those classes where it's just basic Windows, how to navigate Windows, and we stretch them a bit further so that they do that plus the online work. And so these individuals are getting compensated for that work. So that's one way we're trying to think a little differently about it. On the other end, my other side of my work is focused on industrial companies and focused on those companies that, 2, 3, 4th generation companies that want to survive but are having a very difficult time. And, I'm blessed to go visit them and see the workers there who maybe they don't have 4-year degrees, but they're able to raise their families on those wages because, again, it's not a retail wage, or it's a living wage. So, for me, the challenge is how do we make sure these companies survive? How do we make sure also that the entrepreneurs who've stayed the cause are able to pass on the business? A lot of these companies, the CEOs, the presidents, the owners, they plan to retire. Many of them don't even have plans. So I'm not really answering your question, but I'm challenging it a bit further, is that we haven't even thought about that part enough. Is like, who is going to ensure that this company or these many companies who have stayed the course, defied the odds, how are they going to survive into the next generation? What are they doing to ramp up their business to do so?
Great, Wendy.
I was going to say it's a really good question. It's a really important question. I think there are a number of things that look promising. Certainly creating mechanisms that allow young people to create their own jobs. And it doesn't mean, companies that are going to create apps. Setting up their own companies is proving to be really helpful in some communities. Lots of young people are interested in music or cultural industries, but have no idea what processes are involved, and there are a number of projects that are oriented towards that. There are a number of projects. Hammerheads is one of my most favorite. The building trades have got together and, targeting priority neighborhoods, put together programs to bring young people, particularly those who may not have made it through high school, into the building trades. And it's not just that they teach them how to hammer and saw and do all the things they need to do to become apprentices. They also teach them some of the things about coming to work on time, some of the unspoken rules about employment that many people lack because of their environments. And I think the other thing that is so important is so many young people are caught in the catch-22s, no experience, no job, no experience. And whether it's young people who have graduated from university, not graduated from university, or whether it's new Canadians, internships have been proven without question, to help transition into employment for virtually anyone. And we need more corporations, governments, and nonprofit agencies to step up and create those opportunities.
Yeah, just a quick question maybe, or just a quick response. We're just out of time, but go ahead, Kelvin, and
I was
close
just
it
going to
off.
say, we've been talking about, in response to your question, sort of vis-a-vis the people, low-income folks. But there's also a real estate development and a property sort of ramification as well, public policy, where we focus on mixed income housing. so that the folks, while cities are urbanizing and people moving back, that the folks that have gone through the sort of bad times but have lived in cities are able to stay there. So part of it is having public policy say, yes, you can have mixed income housing where market rate housing and lower income housing can coexist. That's well designed, that has great aesthetics. That you can have low income housing or social housing, as you might say it here, where the regeneration of that neighborhood doesn't force all of those folks to move out, which usually has them move farther away from the job centers. So there's a catch-22 that the sort of urbanization and the regeneration of cities is actually having an even worse effect on the folks that need to be closest to the jobs. And so we can, as private sector developers, as public policy folks, as universities, as anchor institutions, force the issue to make sure those folks can stay here as well.
Great last point. And thank you very much for the panel today, Wendy and Kayla, Calvin. Thanks so much for that. It was a great discussion. And we'll head off. Thank you.